Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this roundtable discussion in which we're going to be exploring how HR and L&D can equip employees to face the climate emergency. My name is Becky Norman. I'm the editor of digital publications HRZone and Training Zone, and this session is brought to you by both of those publications alongside our valued partner, the Open University. Now, of course, the topic of climate change is on everyone's lips right now as we're into the second week of the COP26 conference. It really is a pivotal moment for determining the fate of our planet and humanity. And we wanted to use this moment to bring greater awareness to the HR and L&D professions of the important role they can play in terms of the climate crisis. We've got some fantastic speakers taking part in the discussion today, and I'll introduce you to them in a moment. But before we do, I'm just going to quickly run through some of the features on the dashboard. So for those joining us live, we do have some time at the end of the discussion to take questions from you. You can submit these questions at any point during the discussion by clicking on the orange question mark icon. That should open up the question box for you. Please do submit your questions as we go through. This really is a great opportunity to have any queries answered by our experts today. Also, if you want to do some more reading following the discussion, we've recently published a report in partnership with the OU and written by one of the speakers joining us here today. This explores how HR can make better use of psychology to deal with future crises. And it really does offer a fresh perspective on the crisis management kind of area. So you can access this by clicking on the blue paperclip icon. And we've also got a few links in there with some tips from the Eden project as well. Just one final point, you will get a recording of the discussion sent to you shortly after the session today, so you can rewatch in your own time. So moving on to introducing our panel, we have three speakers with varying specialisms joining us to share their insights, examples and guidance to help you drive change. We have Dr. Volker Patton, who's Chartered Psychologist and University Lecturer at the Open University. We have Dawn George, who is Director of HR and Inclusion at the Eden Project. And we also have Nicki Davey, who is Director of Saltbox Training and Events. So I am just going to, before we dive into the discussion, pass over to our panelists, who will tell you a little bit more about themselves, starting with Volker.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Becky, for the introduction. And yes, so I'm a chartered academic psychologist with a background in business psychology. I'm also a registered coaching psychologist with the British Psychological Society. And my area of research that I'm interested in is looking at organizational trust, but particularly more recently, I'm very interested in sustainability, climate change, and in particular the interplay between trust and behavior change and sustainability, and how people respond to crisis and disruption.
Thanks, Volker. Great for you to be here. And Dawn?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Becky. I'm Dawn George. I'm Director of HR and Inclusion at the Eden Project, and we're based in beautiful Cornwall. And there is sun here today. Doesn't always shine. I've been with Eden for about 10 years now. Loved every minute of it. It's fast moving, it's change, it's interesting. At Eden, we work strongly with our team, our employee, our volunteer team, because we believe by creating a movement of people that are aligned in their values and mission, we can make a change. And that's also what we try and do with our visitors to site and partners that we work with, and more recently country leaders, as you'll have seen with G7. Our aim is with Eden is to support people in understanding the message between plants and people and how important that is for the change that we need to go through. Really, Eden's mission has never been so important as it is at the moment as we sit at 1 minute to midnight. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. Really looking to hear your insights, especially coming from the Eden Project. And Nicki?
Thank you, Becky. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Nicki Davey, and I spent many years, about 12 years, I think, working within learning and development in the charity sector. And then 12 years ago, I left to set up Saltbox training and events, and we primarily work to develop teams and develop leaders and develop organisations, mainly using nature-based or creative-based training approaches, and using a very holistic learning approach.
Fantastic, thanks, Nicki. So, moving on to our first question then, I wanted to explore the fact that the climate emergency may not seem to some like an obvious focus for HR and L&D. So I wanted to ask each of you what role these professionals can play. And I want to start with Dawn, talking a bit more about your role at the Eden project specifically.
Thanks. I mean, I think it's perhaps not one you'd naturally think would sit with the people that have the responsibility for the people agenda in an organisation. But we very much think that's part of our responsibility, particularly around our ethos of sustainability and improving the planet, the climate, and all that goes with that. We are a values-led organisation, and that means that the majority of our employees have that passion too. We tend to attract those kind of people who want to work for us as part of their own ethos and values being aligned. And I think the one thing we all know is that there is no planet B, and we take that responsibility really seriously, sharing the mission and the messaging to our Eden team first and foremost, because we need to be able to talk to our visitors about that in a way that is engaging. And we have over 1 million visitors a year. So one of the things we looked at just approximately 2 years ago now, when we ran a whole programme around Earth and the future, is looking at what changes we can all make. And that starts with our employment team. And one of the links you'll find at the end of the webinar is a link to actually some quite short, small pledges, but actually they make a huge difference if you multiply that by how many inhabitants there are of planet Earth, currently about 7.5 billion. If we all work together on those small changes, they absolutely will have an impact. And we think that's part of the piece we can influence in HR. If we can weave that through everything we do, if people become comfortable with that as the fabric of what they do within the work, so we weave it into our policies, our procedures, our training, how we support people, and most importantly, that's led from the top. What we try and do is ensure that all of our employees understand what this is about, and we do that by breaking it down into really clear parameters that we can talk about. But more importantly, that we support people with the agency to change. So we help equip people with understanding how they can make that change and not just seeing it as somebody else's problem or it's too big for me to solve. This is particularly important to us as an HR team. We work very closely as well with schools, colleges, universities, supporting them in sustainable future careers, because we know it's important that we're helping skill our next generation of workers coming through, because they really have that stake in the climate agenda. And the final part for us in terms of what we do and how we do it, and it's so important that we weave that through everything we do, because Eden is on an exponential development growth over the moment. At the moment, we are already building Eden in China. There are more Edens to follow, both in the UK and internationally. But the Cornwall Eden will always be the mothership. And if we can't get it right with the Eden team there, it would be difficult for us to then take that out to all of our teams. And the knock-on of that is then, if we don't do that, we can't influence all of our visitors through the interpretation that we do. So we work really closely with the specialists in the organisation at Eden that we have around climate, sustainability, and telling the story in a really clear way that people engage with. And we do that with our staff as we would our visitors.
Thanks, Dawn. Really exciting to hear that Eden is growing and expanding. And yeah, you can access those pledges by clicking on the useful links widget. It's the blue paperclip icon if it's not up on your dashboard already, so you should be able to access those now. And Nicki, from an L&D perspective, can I come to you?
Yes, I think there are probably 4 or 5 key roles for L&D. I mean, obviously, organisations are going to have to go through a process of massive change. So there's always a role for L&D when change is happening anyway. But I think the key things for me are, one is about actually equipping people in organisations with the skills they need to actually change how they work, to deal with crisis, to deal with uncertainty, to be able to find new ways of doing things as a result of, changes to what might be direct changes as a result of climate change, such as, I don't know, weather events changing the whole supply chain or something like that. Or it might just be changes that the organisation is implementing in order to tackle climate change. But either way, there's going to be a lot of change around what people do and how they do it. So that might be specialist skills for using new technologies, for example, or it might be more general skills about being able to operate in a world full of uncertainty and crisis and disruption and change. But the other areas, I think, are linked to what Dawn was talking about, which is about just ensuring that everybody is empowered to speak out, to take action, to influence how their organisation operates. So making sure that people have the knowledge and awareness that they require to be able to do that, but also the skills and the confidence to actually speak out and act as well. So giving them a sense of their own agency and how they can use that. And then finally, there's a whole big piece around leadership, which I think we'll come on and talk about anyway, but developing leaders within organisations as well for this whole new world.
Thanks, Nicki. So yeah, there's clear, obvious sort of areas where HR and L&D can play a role. Volker, did you have anything to add here from what Nicki and Dawn have said?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that Dawn and Nicki have just talked about. I mean, I think what's really interesting when we're looking at the history of climate change and why we are where we are is because I think historically a lot of promises were made, targets were set that then were missed for various reasons. And I think, we are actually in an emergency now. So I think I would just add that HR and L&D have to act as if there actually is an emergency. To deal with climate change requires a huge mobilization of ingenuity, resources, people. And I guess, just to add to that, HR and L&D have a role to play in ensuring that mobilization is implemented rather than lip service paid to it, but nothing actually changes because, of course, it requires the support from the CEOs and also the kind of policy frameworks that need to be in place as well for that. So I think that would be all I've got to add.
Thanks, Volker. So I wanted to come back to you, Volker, about the report that I just mentioned that you'd written alongside the Open University and HRZone on kind of boosting psychological literacy to tackle future crises, such as the one we're facing with the climate. So I had 2 questions for you. Firstly, what lessons have been learned from managing the COVID crisis that can help HR and L&D with the climate crisis? And also, how can increasing knowledge of psychology in the workplace help with this?
Okay, no, thank you. That's a great question. And yes, I think it's fair to say that COVID has been an unprecedented experience for people all over the world. It's kind of unprecedented also that pretty much everybody in the world, certainly in industrialized countries, has had the same experience. Most of us have been in lockdown across the world. We've had obviously the big shift from a kind of face-to-face world into a virtual world that happened relatively quickly, within weeks rather than months or years, and so it's been an unprecedented undertaking. And in a sense, I mentioned mobilization in my last sort of response. And, this has been akin to a mobilization that you would see, for example, at the beginning of an international conflict. Societies, they go through a process of mobilizing all of their resources for a particular event. And COVID, in a sense, has been that kind of experience across the board. So so one of the things that I think is really interesting when you're looking specifically at work and employment is that, there's always been this assumption that work has to take place in an office or largely take place in an office. And the idea of having everybody work from home would have probably been fairly unthinkable before COVID. I mean, there's always been working from home arrangements, but they were usually, sporadic rather than constant. And so one of the things we've seen actually is we've done something in the UK, but also elsewhere, that people probably would have assumed would be impossible to achieve, to get everybody or a very large proportion of the workforce working from home. And there are some really interesting links here with climate change as well. So, for example, one of the implications of working from home is that basically you don't have commuting. You don't have any kind of sense of commuting except perhaps in key worker kind of jobs. And there has been a net benefit, particularly in relation to things like pollution, and of course also in terms of carbon emissions that are generated by commuter transport. Transport is one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide. So, you can see how the activity that take place as part of work, such as commuting, that are not actually about work, but they're about people getting to work, emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And COVID has kind of taught us that actually, we could actually organize work in a way that doesn't rely quite so heavily on commuting. And with clear benefits in terms of the emissions. So I think, and there are lots of other examples as well. There's probably also various stories around businesses who have operated largely as a face-to-face kind of business, discovering that actually they could operate within their business in a virtual way. We've seen this in universities. So lots of universities that have always traditionally taught face-to-face made it switch very quickly to online teaching. And so that's kind of opened all sorts of floodgates for a greater level of online. But also, I think this is true for business service. And I think Dawn might have a few things to say about that from Eden's perspective. So I guess just to sum up the point about COVID is that it's taught us that actually our societies, our businesses are capable of doing things that we've hitherto thought were impossible to do. And of course, that's relevant to climate change because quite often one of the reasons why climate measures aren't implemented is because people think it's either too costly or too difficult. And so actually, I think this kind of should encourage all of us to be thinking again about how radically different we could actually do things in terms of organizations and how they're managed, including the kind of skills that people need to be able to do those kind of things. So that's my answer to the COVID part of the question. So the psychology is important. I will keep this bit a little bit shorter because I'm aware I've kind of carried on a bit here. But the psychology is interesting because when you have a disruption or a crisis, it impacts on lots of different levels, and not everybody's experience of a crisis is the same. So one of the things we again know from COVID is that some groups of people were more heavily impacted in a negative kind of way. So, for example, young people who live in bedsit accommodation, for them working from home doesn't look the same as somebody who is a senior manager working in a 5-bedroom house, where they've got a dedicated office space. So I think there are these kind of inequalities that actually exist within this space. And I think one of the things that psychological know-how teaches us is very much about identity and the different impact that events can have on different groups of people. And then also understanding those impacts more closely, for example, in terms of whether, the impact is on mental health, whether it's on other issues such as stress, and the kind of skills and supports that people might need to be able to cope with a crisis and absorb the kind of impacts from that, as well as ensuring that the treatment of people is fair and equitable across the board and not making too many assumptions about how a measure might impact on people.
Thanks, Volker. And you mentioned there about mental health and the impact that a crisis can have on mental health. And I want to move on now to talking about eco-anxiety specifically, which has become an increasing mental health issue, particularly for younger individuals. Dawn, I know this is something you're kind of focused on at the Eden Project. Can you tell us a bit more about this issue and what organisations should be doing to support those affected employees?
It's been a really interesting development that we've noticed over the last couple of years, and I think it's an amplification and growth of anxiety. So we are seeing specific COVID anxieties, but I think that's also been compounded on the back of having COVID and anything that's meant for a person, a personal set of circumstances. Brexit obviously is part of that as well in terms of travel, workforce retention, all of those sorts of things. But then having the climate piece on the top of that has really, I think, prompted the need for change and the urgency to act now as well. Volker mentioned there that we've all worked very differently. That hasn't necessarily meant that suited everyone. I know that we certainly had situations where people requested to come and work in the office because they couldn't effectively work from home. So that in itself was an anxiety, and I could probably say we spoke to 50 employees, and whilst there might have been themes to why they were anxious, no two situations were the same. So one of the things that we've been doing, and from noticing that, is really putting in place some more targeted support and backing that with information. So that's been in a number of ways. So we already had mental health first aiders in place at Eden, but we ramped that up quite significantly. We have specialist training for managers so that they can help people and they can identify when they're perhaps in these states and they don't recognise that for themselves. Training for anybody, we've got a number of courses that we've put on. Again, all of these had to be developed remotely as we were going through last year to support people's resilience and their coping strategies, and really ramping up our whole approach to wellbeing and becoming quite creative with delivering some of that because we couldn't physically be together. The eco-anxiety is definitely getting louder. And it was mentioned earlier on, and we've seen it all over the press, that we're hearing this particularly from younger members of staff or those with children and grandchildren, where they're much more focused on that, how we can make a positive difference for the future for those generations to come. And we have, as a result of that, invested in some specialist eco-anxiety training. And that's not just the training team. So it's not just something we've done through the people in the L&D side of the organisation. We've put a number of employees through this specialist training, and it's a train the trainer format, so they can then roll that out to other colleagues. But it is something that we are rolling out in-house, not just to our employees. So we have an education team that sees over 60,000 visitors a year, so that we need to manage it in that 5 to 18 age group. With our partners that we work with on higher education, a lot of the courses, the Eden degrees that we offer, are sustainability based. So the people on those courses are already in this place where they want to make a difference and do this. External programs we deliver, such as Eden Hot House, which is a leadership program, through all of those networks, as well as working with our partners, we are seeing that anxiety. So we needed to equip all of those teams with techniques to be able to manage that. So what we've been doing is very much taking that training on board, making sure we've got a good, strong cascade process in place. We are really putting in the points around identification of the anxiety and then what the specific anxiety is, so that if we can start to make positive change within our Eden team and the networks we work in, we hope that can be cascaded out to other people's networks then, and obviously into their communities, their personal networks. And we're hoping that by doing that and showing people that you can take an active approach to reduce that anxiety, the pledges are one example of that, that helps reduce and control the level of anxiety and moves you more into an action stage rather than the dwelling and the panic stage that you get with the anxiety. So it's just a taster of what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. I love that idea of the cascade approach. It seems like the best way of spreading the message and raising awareness, as some people might not be kind of aware of what this issue is, or what their anxiety is, and presumably managers as well. They might be picking up signs but not be quite aware of what's going on. So
I think great. one of the biggest things is people don't always know that's what they're anxious about, or they think, what we hear mostly is it's too big. How can I impact it? I'm really anxious about it, but I can't do anything. And that's where we feel it's part of our role to help educate people that actually there are things you can do, practical things you can do that will help you feel better about this as well as do real good for the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on, because you were obviously talking about kind of training within that area specifically, I want to move on to talking about the L&D side of things on this topic, and specifically around leadership skills. So the pandemic really made it apparent that equipping leaders with the right skills to lead through times of crisis is really important for business success. Nicki, how do L&D or leadership development professionals go about doing this?
Well, I think, first of all, just before coming on to that, I think it's not just about leaders having the skills to lead people through change and crisis and so on. I think the climate emergency in the state of the world at the moment requires a much bigger cultural shift in terms of leadership and what people see as leadership, and actually leaders taking a much more systems thinking approach, leaders actually being willing and recognising the need to change the culture of their organisation away from kind of consumption and profit towards sustainability and compassion for people and planet and so on. So there's a bigger picture apart from just the kind of helping people deal with crisis and change. Having said that, for all of that, then L&D has absolutely a key role. And in terms of the sort of practicalities of that, I think the first thing is that L&D has to step up and, use its agency as a really key strategic player within organisations. L&D is fundamental to creating change and to creating culture change within organisations. So embracing that. I know in many organisations I see L&D are kind of the people in the corner who get asked to run the training on something after it's happened, rather than the people who are part of the strategic approach to change across the organisation. So there's something in there about just taking that and being heard and getting at the table and having a role in that. From there, really, in relation to leadership, I think there's a whole piece which is around kind of looking at leadership competencies and how do they need to change in this whole kind of new world that we're operating in, developing a new approach to leadership, new leadership competencies, new approaches to leadership development. And I know Dawn mentioned that, the Eden Project's Hot House programme, and certainly the programmes that I'm involved in running, are really about helping leaders to reconnect with some fundamental principles and to do the inner work that is required in order to make the outer action happen. And I think L&D needs to play a key role in ensuring that those programs really are the kind of deep, transformational, meaningful programs that are required. And as part of that, I think as L&D professionals, we have to pay attention to our own leadership and our own development and our own awareness and skills in order to then take on that role. So I think there's something in there about L&D being key drivers of culture change and the change in what is valued, not just what leaders can do, but how other people perceive leadership, so that other people understand, those who are being led also understand why are our leaders leading in this way, what's actually important in a leader, and creating that change across the whole organisation.
Absolutely, Nicki. It's a massive project there. It's not just about having leaders with the right skills. It's getting them to bring their people on the journey with them. Great, thank you for that. We're now going to touch upon green initiatives, which maybe some of you are kind of doing in your own businesses already. And, they are a good step for changing employee behaviours and showing what your business stands for, what your values are. But do they go far enough? Volker, can I come to you on this first?
Yes, certainly. So yeah, at the Open University, we have our own green program. I think it's called Go Green, and really, when you're looking at what a program like that does, is certainly in terms of the publicized events, there are various initiatives such as, increased recycling. At the OU, we have a program that specifically targets difficult to recycle stuff. So we have initiatives in that area, particularly also because we kind of have a science-based kind of approach to this as well. We also have our other services like the restaurant who've kind of changed the way they do things. So, for example, we no longer offer any plastic forks or items that have got plastic in it, and encourage the use of recyclable containers and plates and so forth. So, and a whole plethora of other activities that you will probably find in many organizations nowadays. There's also another strand to green initiatives, which is probably the less publicized aspect of it, where you have champions within organizations whose role it is to kind of help persuade parts of the organizations to think about sustainability in different ways. So one of the examples here we've got is where there are certainly discussions going on at the moment at the Open University, but I think also in lots of other places around things like investments. What should investment look like, particularly in relation to things like pensions? Should an organization have a pension scheme that is invested in fossil fuels, for example? Is one of the kind of questions you can ask. And it's interesting that one of the news from COP26 was Mark Carney's announcement of a big initiative to get big finance companies to really start that process of de-investing in fossil fuels. I mean, I hope that's going to be backed with the actual action that they're promising, because we don't know until actually that's happening. There's always a danger, I feel, around green initiatives to be seen by particularly by ecologically aware people as being some sort of greenwash, that they don't go deep enough. And I think that the intention behind any green initiative is usually a good one, I feel, but I think there's also a need to think perhaps also about, and what else can we do? It's not good enough to say we're going to switch all of the light bulbs to LEDs. It's the what else that actually we're now in the territory of, what else can we do that we haven't tried? What are the new things that we can do? There's some really exciting initiatives. I will be very, very brief on this. So there's various initiatives outside of the university sector in terms of kind of projects to use things like agile project management as a way to kind of design these initiatives, to do fast design sprints, implement initiatives that take a ton out of carbon out of the atmosphere, and then try to scale it up in some sense. So there are some really exciting developments in that, and I think organizations need to engage much more in actually redesigning work, redesigning what we do in organizations, using the tools that actually we have at our disposal.
Thanks, Volker, and yeah, some great examples there. And I think the key is not to just be kind of launching initiatives and dealing with them in silos, but to be coming up with a strategy for sustainability and embedding it within the whole business ecosystem in order to really get maximum impact. Dawn, I'd like to come to you on this kind of issue of embedding it within the whole ecosystem, and the fact really that it's an issue for a range of different people, and it's an issue for the leadership team and not just the responsibility of HR and people professionals. So how can those in the profession influence stakeholders to take on a more holistic approach?
I think it has to be led from the top. I mean, that's the first port. If you haven't got buy-in at your most senior level, in our case, our board and trust, as we are a charity, then anything you try and do below that becomes more difficult. Not to say it's impossible, but it becomes more difficult. So what we do is work closely with the specialists we have in-house. So we'll work with our sustainability and energy manager. We work with our director of interpretation. We work with the universities that we partner with. So we have some good workable sources for data and research that we know that we can act upon. And what we then do is weave that through the fabric of everything we do with our team, with our visitors and our stakeholders. So we always, there are sort of 3 messaging parts we always do, which is about the content, the context of what that is, and the clarity. But within that, we believe that it's not about dumbing down messages. It's very much about making them simple, but so people connect with them. So we will have different messaging depending on who we're talking to, because we need to understand how we're going to connect with those people and make it clear and transparent. The bit that makes it action-based is the twofold, really. So we talk about awe and wonder a lot at Eden, and what we look at is what really makes this subject interesting. What's the wow moment that you don't want people to miss, you don't want them to walk past? And then in doing that, what's the jeopardy that comes with that? So if they do skip past, what's going to happen? And you can make this very individual. But what we also do is make sure that out of anything we do around those frameworks, we give people hope. So there is a sense that it's not all doom and gloom. There are things that can make a difference here at an individual level, as well as a team, a company level, or a global level. And in doing that, you give people the agency to make that change. And what we see then is people in-house working with us. So some of the best people to understand how our own ecosystem can do better are the people that are doing some of those jobs. So we actively encourage that. And we've got lots of examples where members of our team who are in visitor-facing roles have come back to us with suggestions about how something could be greener, or we do things in a different way. Volker touched on pensions. That's one dear to my heart at the moment. So we've worked really closely with our pension provider to look at the default funds we have, as well as the wider funds available of green. And we now have a case where our default pension fund is 80% ESGs. So we aren't totally there yet, but we have certainly made a big shift towards that. I think the final piece we do in terms of that internal ecosystem of getting this right at Eden and how people can actually do something about it. We have a program that we've developed in-house, which is a sustainable enterprise program. And all of our employees will at some stage have that training through their time with Eden. And it's something we refresh, it's something we come back to. And by giving people those sorts of skills, understanding not just about how their job is done, but how there's a wider network of things that come into place. So things like procurement and how we procure our products, where we get things from, looking at the carbon footprint of those. So we're not just talking about things in isolation, we're talking about things on a much wider stage. But by bringing our employees into that and helping them to understand it, really helps us to move forward and keep moving in the right direction. I'm very much aligned to what Volker was saying. Is it's not just, you don't just do this and you forget it. This has to be an evolving picture that we continue to improve. Otherwise, we won't get where we need to go with it.
Absolutely, Dawn. I think it's really important you saying that you need to give your employees hope. It needs to be kind of a positive thing, and that they can really make a change, as of course otherwise you could be exacerbating that eco anxiety that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly that. Yes.
So moving on to Nicki, you mentioned, of course, the need for this to be a whole culture change, and presumably part of that would be improving knowledge and awareness among employees around sustainability, ecology and the climate emergency. Could you talk a little bit more about this and the role that L&D can play here and what needs to be done?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Obviously, people need to have the knowledge and awareness to, well, to understand what's going on and to identify how they can hopefully, as Dawn was talking about, sort of use their own agency and play some kind of a proactive role. But also, in the face of significant change within organisations, within systems, within processes, within, anything that's going on, people are more likely to embrace and commit to new ways of working if they understand the context and they have a really good understanding of why this is happening. So that, again, that knowledge and awareness is essential. And it's not just knowledge and awareness about the climate emergency. It's understanding the whole system. You know, there's a whole load of global challenges and issues that are completely interconnected and interdependent, whether it's around kind of gender and race injustice or overconsumption, health, loss of biodiversity. You know, there's a whole range of things here. And I think it's really important that people understand the bigger picture and how these things are all interconnected, not just, you know, we need to stop using plastic or whatever it might be. So I think the role of L&D in giving people that knowledge and awareness is really fundamental. And we as a profession, we are experts in helping people to learn. So we need to use that expertise to help people to learn that. And that may be through within organisations kind of formal interventions, training courses, workshops, e-learning modules, whatever approaches, coaching, mentoring, or it may be through much more informal approaches, whether it's kind of online discussion forums or just holding conversations in team meetings or giving people opportunities to go off and see what's going on in other organisations. We need to embrace a whole range of different approaches, much like Dawn was talking about, really. But we need to ensure that this is all in place for people to access and for people to be able to use. So I think that's where L&D has a role, not necessarily in doing all of that themselves, but in curating. There's a whole load of information and resources already out there. Videos and online training modules, all sorts of things. There's programs like the carbon literacy training, for example. So it's not that L&D necessarily has to be the experts in this and then impart that knowledge to others, but as a profession, what we have to do is to know where to find the resources and the information that is needed, and to be able to find ways of bringing that and making that accessible to staff, as I say, whether that's informally or formally. But I really strongly believe that L&D professionals need to be talking to each other, learning from each other, networking, connecting with each other, so that they can share and learn from each other about what's working and adopt ideas that other organisations are using as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicki. And another part of kind of the crisis is not just raising awareness, but also equipping employees with the skills and capabilities to help them through crises and to support the business through crises as well. So what kind of skills would we need for this? Presumably, some similar to what we've faced with the COVID crisis. Volker, nice to come to you.
Yeah. I would say, the upskilling process really interesting, because we don't need just upskilling just in relation to climate change. We'd also need upskilling in relation to things like the digital revolution that's coming. The sort of promise and the prediction that a lot of jobs, that currently still exist, will no longer exist by 2030 or around that time span. So I think we do need to think about upskilling as part of a much bigger sort of package. And I think a big part of that is about the role that universities play within this. So, for example, at the Open University, we have a variety of apprenticeships in management, in systems thinking, as well as postgraduate qualifications that are all relevant for this kind of context. They're all about, in some sense, connected to how do we manage change, how do we manage complex organizations and the complexities that they're embedded in. And so I think a lot of the upskilling is in relation to being able to deal with that kind of sheer complexity that we're facing in the future, which isn't just about climate change, it's also about lots of other things. And something that Nicki touched on is about learning from each other. And I think it's about kind of very much changing the focus onto co-creation, collaboration. The way the internet has kind of revolutionized learning as well, is there's a lot of material out there that's very bite-sized already. Some of it is actually free. The OU have some of that material, for example, on platforms like FutureLearn, but there are other platforms as well. And it's about kind of really having a strategy to encourage people to take learning very seriously as something that's not something that's, an onerous activity that they have to do, but as something, is to really promote the kind of culture of learning within organizations as well, which is, I think, absolutely vital. And of course, it does need the investment where the investment is needed, particularly for programs that are, that have a price tag attached to them. But yeah, I think it's those kind of things.
Thanks, Volker. Anything to add, Nicki, on that?
I think Volker's probably covered most of it. There are obviously lots of kind of specific skills, again, around kind of decision making, being agile, navigating through complexity, all the kind of things that Volker was talking about. I think equipping people with a really deep and fundamental understanding of systems thinking and systems approach is really important as well. That ability to recognize that every move you make, every action you take, every decision you make has an impact, has a knock-on impact, and all of these things are interconnected. And I think people need a much better awareness and understanding of that so they can bring that into what they do. But the last thing I think that Volker just touched on is helping people learn how to learn so that people can be good learners, I think is really fundamental as well. So, yeah, but I think Volker's probably covered much of what I would have said anyway.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're now just on to our final question. But before I ask each of you this, just a reminder that we'll be moving on to our audience Q&A next. So we've had a couple of questions in already, so thank you for those. If you do have a question, now is the time to pop it into the Q&A widget that's up on your dashboard, or if it's not, you can access it by clicking on the orange Q&A widget. Great, so final question, quick fire round to each of you. If there was just one action point you'd like the people watching to take away with them today, what would it be? And I'm going to start with Dawn.
Because I'm having trouble.
You okay there, Dawn? Shall I start with Nicki first?
Move on. Yeah.
Okay, Nicki, can I start with you? Oh, you're on mute.
Somebody had to do it. I'm sorry, it was me.
We got through it so far.
I know. I think as learning professionals, we have to recognise and embrace our own expertise in helping people to learn and embrace our role. We need to take people on what might be the biggest and most important learning journey of their lives and for the future of the planet. So we need to really, bring all that we have in order to take people on a really deep, powerful, meaningful learning journey that will impact on people's behaviour and have a positive impact on the planet.
Thanks, Nicki. And Volker?
Yeah, I'll keep it really short and sweet. I've got 3 words. The first one is educate, the second innovate, and the third collaborate. So educate, we've already covered that. Innovate is really important because perhaps one of the biggest innovations we can have in organization is not necessarily technological, such as kind of how we kind of suck carbon out of the atmosphere, but it's social. It's how we innovate our processes within organizations in a social kind of sense to contribute to a reduction in carbon. And then collaborate is because climate change concerns all of us, so we all need to be working together in the same direction to be able to deal with the emergency.
Fantastic, thanks, Volker. And Dawn?
Found my control panel again. It lost it. Sorry. So I think as HR leaders, don't assume that this responsibility is somebody else's in your organisation. I think all too often people see it as a CSR, a sustainability department responsibility. Don't assume that. You have very much, as Volker's just said, you have the collective resources to bring your employees, volunteers together collaboratively and equip them with the right tools through all sorts of medium, as Nicki has talked about today, to be able to act and make a change for the better. I know we've mentioned it, but I would refer people to the Eden's 11 pledges, which are all very simple, very easy for people to get their heads around, but can make a huge difference. So the collaboration piece is one that we always use when we talk about that at Eden.
Great, thank you so much. Really fascinating discussion there, really appreciate it. So we've now got around 10 minutes for the audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions, do get them in to us. I'm just going to kick off with a question from Maria, who's asked, what small changes can we make in the workplace besides reducing the commute to work? Now, I know you've mentioned quite a few during the discussion, including pensions, for example. But is there anything, small changes to, get the journey on the go with climate change and addressing it that you would recommend? Dawn, can I come to you on this?
I think some of those are going back to basics. Are you really doing as much as you can in terms of recycling, repurposing, and really looking at your supply chains? If you can, there is always work that you can do to improve on those. Can you look? Somebody told me about a paperless office 20 odd years ago. I still don't think we fully achieved that. But those sorts of approaches in terms of reducing your resources that you use will have an obvious impact in terms of reducing your footprint. So I think really look at what you are doing internally and what the levers might be there that you can pull to make better.
Thanks, Dawn. And a question that's come in from Vicky. She states helping people to learn is a cornerstone. Do we do enough as organisations, governments and schools so people know how to learn effectively? I think I might know the answer to this. If not, what do we need to do to achieve real change in learning ability in the population? Nicki?
Oh, how long have I got? I could go on about this all day. But absolutely, I mean, I would agree. Fundamentally, our education system needs to change. Absolutely, the way that our education system is designed, as you go through it, and the older you get, and the more kind of senior you get, the less it is designed to operate in a way that works with how the brain likes to learn. So, and the more it wipes out things like creativity and innovation and so on. But I think so. There's a fundamental change to the education system that is required, so that learning is less about retaining and regurgitating information and more about self-awareness, self-knowledge, being able to, do things in different ways, be more creative. There's a whole load of stuff which I could talk about forever on this. Obviously, as an L&D person in an organisation, you may not be in a position to change the whole educational system of the country, but you can change how you do learning in your organisation. And I think that certainly reviewing how all of your training, how all of your development, how all of your other learning interventions are put into place to make sure that, they are holistic, they engage the whole person on all different levels, to ensure that they really enable deep, meaningful, transformational change in behaviour rather than just, again, being able to regurgitate facts. To making learning a joyous adventure. Learning should be a joyous adventure. And so often for many people, I go into loads of organisations where they go, oh, we thought this was going to involve sitting in a room looking at PowerPoint slides all day, but we've done really amazing things. There's a key role for L&D, I think, in overhauling how learning is facilitated within organisations and making sure that it is done in a way which is conducive to good learning, creating positive learning environments, but also helping people to understand how can I be a better learner. And that can be everything from making sure you drink plenty of water to making sure you get plenty of sleep, through to, having an open mind, being curious. There's a whole load of skills that we can take on that enable us to be better learners. And I think L&D teams should be putting that into practice and helping put that into practice in their organisations.
Thanks, Nicki. Volker, did you have something to add in here?
Yeah. Just to add to that, I mean, I think it's interesting, in particular from somebody who works at a university. I think there's been a sea change in terms of how we conceptualize learning. Quite often, I think learning has been framed as something that is kind of done to people in a way. There's that, you have a teacher who teaches, and I think it's the actual model of learning that needs to also adapt. I think so. Nicki kind of touched on that to some extent, but it's by involving people in projects and using the project as an opportunity to learn, to find, to work as part of a group and to contribute to group learning. I think that's also one of the things that I think fits in with this. And I could talk about it for hours as well, so I won't. But yeah, great question.
Thanks. And I've got another great question from Jules. She says there's also some unlearning to be done as well, as we all have lots of habits we're holding on to that are not good enough for the environment, such as jumping into cars when we could use public transport, doing the online shop rather than using local shops, etc. And sometimes the unlearning is more of a hurdle. So, Volker, can I come back to you on this one? How you think we can get rid of those habits?
That's a really tough one. I think particularly in climate change. So you find that the data from research suggests that most people understand there's a problem with the climate and that they need to do more. But when you ask them to decommit from the obvious things like flying in an aeroplane, for example, most people don't actually want to do it because it kind of, in a way, impacts on their lifestyle and the idea of going on a holiday in a sunny place, and so on, is threatened by that. So I think that it's not a case of unlearning. It's about kind of how do we get past some of the resistances that people have to doing things differently, and that's a very different question, because you're not actually, at a cognitive level, people understand that flying is really bad, but they still do it in the same way that people might say, oh, I ought to be eating less meat because there's too much fat or too many hormones in it, or it's not good for my health. But actually changing it is, you're kind of going against lots of cultural things. You're going against, there's an element of knowledge as well. So I think in a sense, it's better to frame this not in terms of unlearning, because there's actually, once the brain has learned something, it doesn't tend to unlearn it. You don't suddenly forget how to ride a bike if you haven't ridden it for a while. You might be a bit, shaky when you get back on a bike. But we don't tend to unlearn things, so once it's been learned. So it's about kind of replacing the behavior that's problematic with new behaviors that gives at least the same kind of reward for the behavior, if not actually more, that actually creates much better outcomes for people that are visible and tangible, and people have the benefit and so on. But it's a minefield, because these things, they can also backfire. So, and I just want to kind of emphasize this as well, because it's important, is that, you could, for example, advertise that, okay, if you save energy because of change in light bulb, you're going to save so much money a year. But one of the things that we found through research is that when people save money, they then spend that money on flights. Okay, so you can see how, the savings that you've created in terms of climate then backfire, and they create other problems further down the line. So it is a minefield, and I think you have to be very very clear as to what's the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and then work very carefully through a kind of program, really, of how do you change that behavior, and how do you reward it, how do you set the right kind of norms, what's your messaging that you're going to be using to kind of drive that new behavior through an organization. But I do believe also, organizations have a huge role to play in setting those new norms. And a really good example of that is look at what's happened with smoking. Smoking has become unacceptable in the workplace as a result of a whole number of different things, but including the idea that you can't do it inside. It's generally not regarded as a socially acceptable kind of thing to be doing, and I guess something like that could also work with climate change.
Great, thank you so much, Volker. That's all the questions we've got time for, unfortunately. I know there were some questions that got missed, so sorry about that. We do have LinkedIn information to all the speakers, so if you wanted to reach out directly to them via LinkedIn, you can do so. Don't forget, you will get a copy of the recording sent to you so you can rewatch it in your own time. And do take a look at those resources we've linked to. So that's the psychological literacy paper written by Volker, and also a couple of articles from the Eden Project, the pledges and the tips. So do take a look at those as well. Thank you so much, Volker, Dawn and Nicki, for sharing your insights today. It's really been a fascinating discussion. And thanks so much to all of you in the audience for joining us. We hope you found the webinar useful and have a lovely rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.